Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Greg Douquet. I'm co-director of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project and a senior fellow at Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. I'll be your moderator today. I am delighted to be joined today by a really terrific panel as we discuss lessons from conflict zones, energy access in fragile and developing countries. But before we get started, a few housekeeping notes from me. This event is on the record, and we are currently live streaming on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage to post about what you hear today and share on social media using the hashtag VetsInEnergy and by tagging us at AC Global Energy and Vets_energy. If you'd like to participate in our conversation, and we hope you will, we have a great panel that's ready to mix it up with you. We encourage you to do so. Submit your questions in the question and answer portal located at the bottom of your screen at any time during the event, and we'll incorporate them as appropriate. Please note, however, only those directly engaging via the Veterans Advanced Energy app will be able to submit questions. So let's set the scene and talk about energy access in fragile and developing countries. What's happening out there behind the scenes? Sufficient energy is fundamental in establishing security and stability in fragile and developing countries around the world. Those on this program, our audience of veterans and military families, you understand this, you've lived it as practitioners. Reliable energy promotes safety and security by bringing light to common areas, allows agricultural communities to refrigerate produce until it gets to market. And reliable energy sheds light in households trying to educate their children. In short, reliable energy is an essential requirement for social and economic stability. And we're going to get to that today as we talk about the social justice of environment and energy. But too often, the West's idea of what fragile developing countries require is ill-conceived or unsustainable. And too often, the most accessible energy for fragile and developing countries is also the most harmful to their health and to our planet. So we're fortunate today to have four panelists who are deeply experienced experts steeped in the intersection of development, stability, and energy. Kyeh is the Principal Deputy Vice President, Department of Compact Operations at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC. Kyeh has over 20 years of experience in international development and project management in the public and non-governmental sectors. As Principal Deputy Vice President of the Department of Compact Operations, she's responsible for overseeing the Africa region portfolio of compact programs and supporting the Vice President in managing the department. Kyeh joined MCC in 2004, right at the beginning, as one of the first project managers and helped lead the project preparation, due diligence, and negotiations of the first compact with Madagascar. She later led transactions to successful close in Mali, Namibia, Zambia, totaling over $1 billion. Kyeh also managed the implementation of compacts throughout Africa as managing director for East and Southern Africa, and then served in a global role as Deputy Vice President of Infrastructure, Environment, and Private Sector. Welcome to UK. Jake Cusack is co-managing partner of the CrossBoundary Group. CrossBoundary Group is an innovative investment advisory firm that seeks to unlock private capital to drive sustainable growth in frontier markets. They have over 80 investment professionals and offices in 6 offices in Africa, 2 in Asia, as well as London and DC. The firm manages CrossBoundary Energy and CB Energy Access, which are investment vehicles for distributed solar energy generation. Prior to CrossBoundary, Jake served as a Marine Corps officer in Iraq. He's written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. Jake has an MBA from Harvard Business School and MPP from Harvard Kennedy School and a BA from Notre Dame. Welcome to you, Jake. Sherwin is co-founder and managing director of Energy Peace Partners. Energy Peace Partners, or EPP, believes that renewable energy can serve as the building blocks for peace. EPP brings together experts in renewable energy and peace building in order to develop solutions that catalyze new renewable energy developments in regions affected by violent conflict. Sherwin spent more than a decade with the United Nations, deployed in UN peacekeeping operations, political missions in the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and Central Africa. His UN work focused on conflict prevention, mediation, and post-conflict stabilization. Upon leaving the UN, Sherwin became a senior fellow in the program on conflict, climate change, and green development at UC Berkeley's Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, which served as the launching pad for Energy Peace Partners. Very, very good to have you with us, Sherwin. And last but not least, my friend John Gerlaugh, Executive Director and founder, Team Afghan Power. Team Afghan Power is a nonprofit using a development model based on experiences of military and civilian veterans of the Afghan War. TAP's focus is on improving education and economic opportunity at the rural village level through the development of sustainable renewable energy programs powering schools and microenterprise. Jake is a former Marine Corps officer. You might notice a theme here, with service in Okinawa, Korea, the Middle East, and Africa. Since then, he has worked in both the public and private sector with a focus on post-conflict economic development in Somalia, Colombia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So welcome to our panel. As you can see, we've got a great group of experts here to mix it up. Kyeh, let me start with you, if I might. Can you give us a view of the landscape of energy access in fragile developing countries? And also, you shared with me earlier a story about MCC energy deal in partnership with the World Bank in support of the government of Ghana that never got across the finish line. And in many respects, as I thought about it, this experience highlights many of our discussion points today, namely, how do you assess the feasibility, acceptability, and suitability of a recipient of an MCC grant? Can you share with us a bit about this experience, Kyeh?
Sure. Thanks, Greg, for having us. It's a real pleasure to be on the panel. First of all, just a quick introduction. Again, my name is Kyeh Kim, and I manage the Africa portfolio at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC. I think probably lots of folks in the audience may have not heard of MCC. It's a small government, U.S. government agency that provides grants to developing countries. And so far, since our inception in 2004, we've provided over $12 billion in grants to our partner countries. First of all, we're very selective in choosing our partners. We are working with some of the poorest countries in the world, but we are also trying to work with countries that are well governed. And so we have a scorecard that has three major categories. One is has democracy and governance indicators, including anti-corruption. The second is in social sectors or investing in people, so things like health and education, investments by the government. And thirdly, our category captures economic freedom, things like trade policy, days to start a business. So country partners first have to qualify for MCC funding, and they have to pass at least half of the scorecard, including the anti-corruption indicator. Once they're in the club, there are still many additional qualifiers. First, we work with the countries to develop a program that addresses binding constraints to economic growth. And what we're finding is that throughout the world, but particularly in Africa, we're finding that energy is a binding constraint to economic growth. So what does this mean? It means that without energy, these countries will have a very, very challenging time of uplifting the GDP of that country unless they do address this issue of energy insecurity. So the one example, I was talking to Greg about this, I was working on a deal in Ghana, and we had provided about $500 million for an energy-focused program. And part of this program was really contingent on the performance of the main state-run utility. And together we assessed that the best way to improve the performance is have basically private management of the company through a private concession. And part of our grant, about $190 million, was contingent on this concession being successful. So we went through the procurement process, and after some time, it was determined by the government of Ghana that they wanted to terminate this concession, and it's for reasons that both parties kind of disagree upon. But nonetheless, our $190 million was contingent on that. The World Bank also had money that was contingent on that concession going through, as well as private sector. So altogether, over $1 billion of funding was lost due to this. And I think the moral of the story is really countries do need to adhere to their commitments. B, that improving performance through private sector is often the right path. And that C, continuing down the path of what we consider as good management of their state-run utility will lead to the sustainability of our investments, which was exactly what we were trying to do.
Okay, one of the interesting things about MCC, and I think it was founded upon the idea of partnering not only with the government, but with private concessions, with private industry. Don't you require a private partner every time you do an investment in a given country?
What we like to do is really leverage public sector investment with private sector investment. And so if we are looking at GDP growth, we are looking at increases in household income and private sector income in the country. And so by that nature, it really is imperative that we partner with the private sector. And I think if you look at flows of FDI in these countries, it's increasing quite a bit. And so we are looking at blended finance models and how can we bring PPPs to conclusion.
Thank you for that. It's a great story. It really highlights a lot of what we're talking about. Thanks for sharing with us. Jake, let me ask you to address the same question from an investor perspective. And perhaps you can give us an example as well. Now, what's your view of the landscape of energy access in fragile and developing countries? And how do you at CrossBoundary assess the feasibility, acceptability, suitability of a recipient of an investment?
Sure, and thanks very much to the Atlantic Council and to this group to having me. I think the first thing that's worth highlighting is that if you survey, and the World Bank and others have done this, if you survey fragile state investors or companies operating in fragile states, what's their number one obstacle to business? The number one obstacle is the availability and the quality of electricity supply, over and above political instability, over and above corruption, over and above the usual issues that you hear about. It's the cost and reliability of electricity, which in some ways is somewhat obvious, because if you don't have reliable electricity, it's very hard to do even light manufacturing. And so when you think about tackling the challenges of fragile states, the challenge of electricity is often central. One of the first times that we started to seriously get involved or look at how we could invest in energy provision in these places was in South Sudan in 2012. The largest private company there, an employer at the time, was actually SAB Miller, which had basically a beverage bottling and brewery in the country. That was running on 5 megawatts of diesel generators at quite considerable expense. And as you might guess, South Sudan has a great potential solar resource, and we thought there was a good opportunity to bring the financing model that's worked so well elsewhere in terms of doing a PPA directly to this business. And the economic case was strong. Unfortunately, South Sudan fell into essentially a civil war about 12 months later, but it was sort of an example to us of both the need of businesses for this type of investment, and that solar energy without any subsidies, without any special tax breaks, could actually be the cheapest, most reliable source of energy. Still integrated, obviously, with, at least at this point, with the given its intermittency, with diesel or grid power if available. And so we've really been taking that forward over the last 9 years or so. And I think the investment case and the acceptable return, and we can get into this, and the need for the blending of the finance, as Kyeh was talking about, is different depending on if you have a beverage company as your customer, or if you're trying to do rural mini grids. The economics look very different.
So, small world. I was Chief of Staff of Marine Forces Africa during that civil war in South Sudan you just alluded to. Were you one of the non-combatants that we pulled out of that fray, Jake?
I was not, because I left 2 days earlier, but one of my business partners was.
All right. Well, there you go. You owe United States Marine Corps a big thanks, my friend. Semper Fi. All right. Hey, John, unlike Kyeh, who negotiates with the United Nation states at the ministerial level, Team Afghan Power works at the rural village level, where you seek to expand educational microeconomic opportunities so these communities can move beyond subsistence farming. As I understand it, your ultimate goal is to inoculate these villages against violent extremist recruiting with renewable energy as a major component of this equation. So, how did Team Afghan Power settle on this development model as a goal, and especially the application of renewable energy as a critical component?
Sure. Well, like the others, I'd like to thank you, Greg, and the team at Atlantic for putting this on. It's a great venue. Um, you know, we really have our roots, our origin, and Semper Fi, right back to you, by the way, in the veterans of the Afghan war that came back, and we kind of crowdsourced some ideas about how we could bring a different component, a little more potent component than hard power, a little more lasting and a favorable component to the Afghan war, basically. And we decided that we would first study the problem, which we did for a few years, and then go into creating a nonprofit. And the idea behind the nonprofit is really twofold. One is that there's been an awful lot of money spent at the national level in Afghanistan. The national government of Afghanistan has been the recipient of billions and billions of dollars of aid. Some would argue if you tallied it all up with the security forces, it'd be close to $1 trillion. But much of that money and the effort and projects that it was designed to stimulate had not reached down to the rural village levels. If you read the history of Afghanistan, really it's the rural villages in Afghanistan, according to United Nations count 40,000 roughly, is the heart and soul of Afghanistan. It's where the majority of the population lives. It's the most conservative part of the country. And it's the recruiting pool, for the insurgency, as it has been in almost every country where there's been an insurgency. It's the villages, not the cities. Veterans are pretty comfortable being in the rural villages. That's the majority of the force that went from the United States served there in the rural villages. So we sort of, put our thinking caps on and said, well, what are rural villages missing? And we took a number of polls and surveys, and I went over and talked to a lot of folks in Afghanistan after 4 tours with the U.S. government there. And we decided that the one thing they were missing was not food and water. They have subsistence farming down pretty well, with a few exceptions when there's droughts or a particularly horrible, environmental catastrophe, landslide or something like that. But by and large, they can fend for themselves food and water-wise. But the next step up from that would be the provision of electricity. The national government has a plan to electrify the country, but it's industrial era style design. It's large power poles stretching across the country and using dams and so forth, which are fine. But there's going to be a long gap in time before it reaches out to the more rural populations in Afghanistan. However, as the other panelists can tell you, the advancements in renewable energy have been jaw-dropping over the past 10, 15 years. So off-grid energy, if it's done right, and that's a key thought, if it's fielded correctly, can really make a big difference in a village. It can certainly create an educational environment they don't have by connecting to the internet. Much of their educational standards are really substandard. And by getting them government-approved modules of education, they can really advance their. It's a generational, effort, but they can advance. And then microeconomic activity in other venues, telemedicine, you name it. So that's what we decided we would go after. And we've got a candidate village we're working in now. It's about a very small, but it's manageable for us. And we'll electrify the school and then develop it from there and see where it goes. And by the way, one of your panelists, Jake, and his group, CrossBoundary, have been a major player in our efforts. They provided us a huge amount of intellectual capital in designing our financial models and advising us. So Jake, tip my hat to you and your team. Thanks for your support there.
Super.
Thanks, John. It's great work you're doing.
John, I'm not proud in saying I'm one of the architects of one of those ill-conceived major projects that you're trying to counteract, running strategy in Afghanistan and Pakistan, 2009 and 10. You might remember we tried to put a energy project running from Kajaki Dam down to Kandahar, with Kandahar being right the jewel of the crown. That the ambassador at the time, Eikenberry, said wasn't going to work because it wasn't sustainable. And we, ISAF, thinking that we knew better, did it anyway to the tune of about $500 million, only to learn it wasn't sustainable. So very, very fair points that you're making, and looks like you're doing it the smart way rather than the expensive way. So well done to you and to Jake. Sherwin, let me turn to you in Energy Peace Partners. You've identified 27 target countries where increased renewable energy development can contribute to peace and stability. How did you identify these countries, and what does renewable energy offer to their populations?
Sure. Thanks, Greg, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for the opportunity to be here. We looked at three phenomena or indicators in our work. We looked at the countries most affected by conflict, at risk of conflict, as well as those that are highly vulnerable to climate change. And then we overlapped those phenomena with energy poverty. We looked at the countries with low levels of electrification. And we identified, as you said, 27 countries that are at high risk of conflict, that are highly vulnerable to climate change, and at the same time, they have extremely low levels of electrification, under 20%. So another way to say that is that the least electrified countries in the world are also dealing with conflict issues, which are being exacerbated by climate change. And the renewable energy boom and revolution that we're seeing elsewhere is not happening at scale in this group of fragile countries. The key problem is lack of finance. There is more than $500 billion in global climate finance, most of which goes to renewable energy, but very little of that renewable energy investment flows into conflict-affected states. So what we did was we put together a group of experts in renewable energy development and finance, as well as folks who've spent their careers like myself working on peace building. And we take a peace building lens to renewable energy. How can looking at renewable energy in a different way, expanding how we think about renewable energy, actually help promote peace and stability in these contexts? And for example, how can renewable energy help to support peace? There are, as we've talked about already, there are socioeconomic benefits to increased energy access and new renewable electrification, but there are also opportunities for cooperation, confidence building, resolution of disputes if you introduce renewable energy projects into some of these contexts. Immediately after the signing of the peace agreement, there's a window where the population looks for tangible peace dividends. Renewable energy projects provide that opportunity. And another thing that's not talked about so often is the role of energy in conflict-affected regions in general. So there are, we know, illicit revenues from diesel markets and charcoal markets that flow to conflict actors, that flow to armed groups, that sustain the conflict. And renewable energy provides a counterpoint to that. We believe that renewable energy can help to mitigate those conflict dynamics and actually support peace-building initiatives. So our objective, I would say, is to expand the toolkit for the folks that are working on peace building, that are working on stabilizations in these contexts, expand the peace builders and stabilization toolkit to include renewable energy.
You know, you're reminding me that, the Department of Defense used to get wrapped up around the axle between peacekeeping and peace enforcement, and generally, was ready to step into a peace enforcement role at the drop of a hat. But how do you differentiate between peace and stability in this context, Sherwin?
Well, I think what we are working on is trying to identify and articulate the concrete social benefits from a renewable energy project intervention. And I can talk a little bit more about detail, some of the solutions and approaches that we've developed, but I think that's what we try to focus on. What are the concrete benefits to populations working in these communities from specific renewable energy interventions?
Interesting. So I would say to our audience, please do throw in. We got a great panel here, and lots of great opportunity for discussion, and something that you're very familiar with your operational experience as veterans. Jake, let me turn back to you. Is it a mistake to consider energy investments in developing countries strictly in terms of stability, or should we take a broader view that includes security and ultimately prosperity, something that investors are certainly interested in? And if so, how does this advance U.S. national interests?
Yeah, there's a lot there in that question. I think the first part is that certainly private sector investment, and specifically investment into renewable energy in fragile states, is not just a good thing to do for those countries and their people. It's also a tool of foreign policy, an important tool of foreign policy. I can think about my own Marine Corps experience, and early in my first deployment, being in a relatively large Iraqi town, and just thinking that I knew I'd been trained where the machine guns should go, but I had no idea how to solve water and sanitation issues, the lack of electricity, city council type issues that were actually on people's minds. And so I think we do a disservice when we don't think about the role of investment and business when we approach the challenges of fragile states. The next point, and I think it's been touched on by others, is that the private sector can bring innovation and finance where the government might not have the capacity or the finance themselves. And you can look, a lot of money and large numbers were thrown around early in this conversation. A lot of money has gone into these countries on a grant basis, and often that has not been sustainable. Even if you look at, say, health clinics in Africa, a lot of health clinics in Africa have been electrified with donor dollars, but not many of those systems are still operating because there's no one with a strong incentive and the knowledge to maintain those systems. Whereas we've invested in mini-grids in Tanzania, for instance, and now we have a long-term commitment because we have to return the money to our investors to see those things continue to operate for 20 years. So I absolutely think it's all intertwined, and it is even in the interests of the taxpayer in Detroit, Michigan, to care about how people are living in other parts of the world and whether they receive electricity, because it comes back to them, whether it's in how global pandemics spread or are contained. It comes back to them in security instances where their family members or friends might have to go fight. All of those things are interconnected.
That's a great answer. You covered a lot of ground. Tough question. Appreciate it. Okay, we're starting to get some good questions in from our audience. I've got one here from my friend John Gillis, who has put in an application for the Veterans Advanced Energy Fellowship, which I would commend to all of you. Thank you, John. And John asks, working at a U.S. electric utility company, I've been impressed to see how much technical expertise managing the distribution system requires. When you develop local energy projects in developing economies, for example, in rural communities, do you also develop energy system expertise in those areas, similar to what we have in the U.S.? So I think what John's question is about is, right, the sustainability of the projects that you all are investing in and developing so that they perpetuate after you pull out. Kyeh, can I ask you to take a first shot at that one?
Yeah, sure. I think central to all our energy investments, and we've currently we have over $2 billion portfolio of investments in Africa. It's significant, and it's really, really important that the utility company is a strong actor that performs based on benchmarks, and we can make sure that our investments are sustainable. So, as Jake had said, investing in clinics, health clinics, without sort of the institutional support or the long-term plan of how to operate and maintain these facilities is something that's absolutely critical. So in the case of utilities, we do provide technical assistance and support to these. We often bring in world-class management experts in utility management, and we often bring in U.S. utilities actually to provide that support. We have some twinning arrangements also with some U.S. utilities so that folks can learn about how to manage a strong utility and look at sort of the different models of operations and maintenance, management models, distributing electricity, making sure that there's, in some cases, cross subsidies to lower income households and things like that. So it's absolutely critical to bring in that U.S. expertise. We're also bringing U.S. technology as well. So we are having conversations with some major players in renewable energy that can provide that innovation and expertise and kind of leapfrog technology on the continent.
That's great. Great answer. Thank you for that. Anyone else have any comments on that one?
I can add something. I mean, we have found since we began this work, our work, and I can talk about it more later, we've developed a financing instrument that supports mini-grid developers in our target countries, most of which are in sub-Saharan Africa, but not exclusively. And we have found in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Somalia, in South Sudan, in Chad, difficult places to work historically, that there are entrepreneurs that are building mini grids and that are able to access international finance. So I think, given the projected growth trajectory of Africa, the demographics of Africa, the fact that the economics of solar are just so strong, we are seeing a lot of entrepreneurship and capacity that already exists in these countries. And I think that's what all the folks on this panel, that's the kind of expertise and capacity and entrepreneurship that we exactly want to support. It's there, and I think it will only expand.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Sherwin.
I've got one ad, Greg, if you want.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, just down really at the tactical level, and my colleagues have a much broader global view of this, but it plays to what Sherwin just said. The entrepreneurial spirit in villages and the entrepreneurial spirit in those areas, and the sort of the stick-to-itness, which is, I suppose you could argue, is peculiar to a population who have had to endure great hardship, is really impressive in the areas that we're working. And we have found that if you make the design of the system simple enough, and you train people that are from the village it's supporting, and you put them in charge in a very simple governance structure that everyone agrees to, the village shura and the CDC and so forth, the community development councils, that you'll end up with a guy who's kind of got the rose pinned on him to make the things keep working. And if it's a matter of cleaning off panels and filling batteries with water, they'll do that. In fact, they'll do it in a way that is unique to them. In some instances, the village agrees to pay them for that service. And so now you've got a guy that or a gal that may have not had any employment before, who now has a job. So it becomes a self-licking ice cream cone if you do it right.
Okay, great. We have another question. Do you see energy storage development alongside energy generation in those same countries? Batteries, pumped hydro storage. So the storage side of the equation that we're still wrestling with in this country, what does it look like in the developing countries that you all are working with? Any thoughts on that one? Jake, looks like you got something.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I can chime in. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So because the cost of electricity, or the willingness to pay, the ability to pay, is higher because there's no alternative source, then batteries make sense on most mini grid sites now today. There's not, as everyone knows, both the price of solar and the price of batteries are declining very rapidly. So these economics are only improving, but already today, batteries are part of each of these mini grid sites that we're working with. And then for commercial and industrial sites where they might have some grid or unreliable grid, often battery is part of the solution. Batteries are part of the solution as well. Pumped hydro is a little bit different. Usually that's used in the context of utility scale type projects. But for what we're talking about, which is often very small, systems for small villages, batteries are already part of the solution.
Okay, good news. Anyone else? Okay, we have a question here from Alec Emmert for Jake, and he says, "I'm a veteran and a recent Wharton graduate supporting Team Afghan Power." There you go, John. Along with a group of fellow Wharton and HBS students or veterans. There's a huge appetite among us to support development projects in regions where we have served. What recommendations do you have for us to find these types of careers that leverage both our military and business backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, so you can look on the careers page of our website for one portion of that.
Good start.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, what I, because we speak at business schools and things like that. And what, I always try and say is like, people have this set of skills. Sometimes maybe they worked at Goldman or JP Morgan, or they worked at McKinsey or BCG. And depending on where they did that, they might feel like those skills are pretty far away from what's needed in these markets. But the reality is that those skills are actually very applicable and often missing. It's actually, that fusion too of people who can speak both the language of the private sector, but the language of defense and diplomats, and having the ability to translate between the two is often missing. And, helping out, whether it's NGOs like Team Afghan Power, pairing up with local businesses on the ground, like that skill set of being able to build a financial model, help think through a business plan is really relevant and needed, and is a contribution, I think, to American national security as well. So if you feel like maybe you wanted to join the military or join the diplomatic corps at some point and you didn't, it's absolutely another way to serve your country, to contribute to bringing energy there.
You just articulated beautifully our mission in Veterans Advanced Energy Project is providing veterans and military spouses another venue to serve, Jake, in advanced energy. So thank you for that. Kyeh, lest we forget about the public sector and the great work that the public sector organizations such as yours at MCC are doing in establishing security, stability, and prosperity around the world. How are the opportunities these days for someone like Alexander, who's got these skill sets both as a veteran and an MBA? What can they do to help at MCC?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We have a number of vets that work at MCC, and I think the combination of having field expertise, and many of them come with language expertise as well, is absolutely critical to the work that we do. I think also, combine that with a business degree, and that's a pretty amazing set of skills to bring to the table to kind of work through solutions. Again, we are a U.S. agency leveraging public sector with the private sector, and so the private sector is absolutely central to what we do. So having someone who can think about business, think about the ROI in our investments, and we do something similar in looking at our investments. We look at the economic rate of return. So we want to make sure that our economic rate of return has a minimum of a 10% hurdle rate, and it's kind of a different framework, but it's very similar to what a business person would look at in terms of ROI. So I think of looking at that sort of profitability, the revenue streams, the sustainability is really important. So again, that sort of cross section of having practical field experience through the military with business expertise as well would be a very inviting candidate for MCC.
That is a great segue into our next question, which I think pertains to social impact investing. And how do you assign a return on investment to something that is a social good as opposed to a harder ROI. The question comes from Ryan McLaughlin, and he asks all of our panelists, how do each of your enterprises balance the altruistic nature of expanding renewables into these fringe areas while still making it a viable and sustainable pursuit financially? As mentioned earlier, grant and donor money can oftentimes be intermittent. Sherwin, you want to take a first shot at that one?
Sure. I mean, that's exactly one of the problems we're trying to solve. Again,
Right.
Lack of renewable energy investment and finance in fragile states, grant funding not being predictable.
Yeah.
So what we did at Energy Peace Partners is we looked at energy attribute certificate markets. Energy attribute certificates, they're known as renewable energy certificates or credits in the States, guarantees of origin in Europe, or IRECs internationally. And maybe just very briefly, the way it works, it's kind of a sister mechanism to a carbon offset. Mm-hmm. 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy generation is equivalent to 1 REC. And that's a tradable virtual commodity. The buyer of that REC buys the environmental attributes or the claim to renewable energy of that generation. And REC markets, it's $1 billion plus market globally. REC markets have really driven or contributed to driving renewable energy growth worldwide. So we looked at REC markets and we noticed that there are effectively no REC markets in fragile states. And so we've spent the last 3 years working to extend REC markets to our target countries. And we successfully piloted the first project in DRC this year. We created something called a Peace Renewable Energy Credit, or a PREC. And what that is it's a traditional renewable energy credit in terms of the renewable energy generation that's green, combined with high impact social co-benefits that are associated with renewable energy generation in DRC or Somalia or South Sudan or other target geographies. So just to talk in more concrete terms, we worked with a developer in Eastern Congo. We started working with them last year. The name of the developer is Nuru, which means light in Swahili. Nuru was building a brand new off-grid 1.3 megawatt minigrid in Eastern conflict-affected Congo in the city of Goma.
Wow.
And they had raised all the financing to build the project. We worked with them and asked them if we were to help you further monetize your generation. It was a commercial off-grid mini-grid, so they were building it out while signing new customers. Mm-hmm. But there's no additional way to monetize that generation as there is in the United States and Europe and other countries through mm-hmm. the sale of RECs. Mm-hmm. So we said, if we were able to market and sell Peace renewable energy credits from your project, provide you with a second income stream, could you do something additional for the community? And so they consulted with the community. Together with the community, they co-designed a street lighting project. And we marketed that project as a PREC project. The revenue from the sale of PRECs could fund this nighttime street lighting project that was connected to their mini grid. Wow. In a neighborhood with no electricity infrastructure, with no light on the streets. Businesses had to shut down when evening time came. And there was a high amount of insecurity and banditism, as you say in French, on these streets. And so we were able to successfully find a corporate buyer to purchase the PRECs, which allowed the developer to fund this additional community project that was implemented in March of this year. And so the benefit for the developer is that they were able to monetize their renewable energy generation in a different way, provided them a new income stream. The corporate buyer was able to, through their sustainability budgets, the budgets through which they usually purchase RECs, they were able to support this social impact project from their sustainability budgets. Mm-hmm. At the same time, meeting their corporate social responsibility or sustainability targets. And the community benefited from new renewable electrification. And we've seen pictures of night markets, videos of what is happening in the community since the streetlights were implemented. And for what we're working on now is essentially trying to market and sell PRECs for developers who are raising financing so that the PREC pre-sale can help future builds, future mini-grid projects. And I guess what's the most exciting about this instrument is that it effectively creates a market for renewable energy generated in fragile settings,
Mm-hmm.
which didn't exist before. It
Mhm.
provides an entry point for corporations in the voluntary rec markets to support specific projects
Mm-hmm.
in fragile states.
Mm-hmm.
And getting back to your original question, it is a market mechanism. So it is something that we think is replicable and scalable and provides an alternative to grant funding renewable energy projects. So our objective now is to quickly replicate and scale this across our target geographies.
P-Rex, great idea, super creative.
Greg, can I add something to this?
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. As I had mentioned before, our organization does an economic rate of return. And when we're looking at sort of rural electrification or off-grid or mini-grid investments, it tends to be hard to meet our hurdle rate. And so one thing that we do is accompany with our investments, whether they be anything in sort of renewable energy, they could be mini hydro or solar, wind. We provide some assistance to the communities and businesses and productive use of that energy, such that if we are providing sort of energy in sort of an agricultural zone, then we're also looking at sort of value added agriculture or agriculture processing, or how do we encourage light manufacturing. And so that way you're really looking at, not only the sort of philanthropic use of energy such that school children have lights to do their homework, but also, how does that build the economic opportunities in that community for more income generation?
Yeah, so you don't inadvertently destabilize. That's a great segue into our next question, which is ultimately about sustainability. Also, it comes from Jeffrey Dickinson. He says, based on my experience investing in setting up small rural energy utilities in developing countries, enterprise governance, and I think that's the focus of this question, is governance over the long term, is crucial for sustainability. How have the panelists working on the ground started building a bench, so to speak, of procedures and people to be ready 5 to 7 years down the road when new capital for maintenance and/or expansion demands comes up? Often village councils and such are not capable of this crucial business function. How do you sustain it 5, 7, 10 years down the road? Who wants to take that one up?
I'll take a stab at
You got it, John.
what we've learned but not been able to implement yet, Greg, and that is that, and actually this again came from our CrossBoundary partners. If you do what we've done in so many war zones around the world, which is build a project and walk away from it, in many instances you may have wasted your effort doing it, and we're all full of sea stories about how that's happened.
Yeah.
Engaging the community in a way that solves the problem the person who asked that question posed is key. The thing about Afghanistan, and I'm an outlier, I guess, because most folks are talking about Africa, but Afghanistan villages have governance bodies that are really quite ancient and work very well. That's the Shura. We would recognize it as a small town council.
Right.
Members to that body are elected. They're held to a higher standard than the average citizen in the community, and they have to basically get resources for their constituents, or they're I'll say voted out of office. It's often not like that, but and so if you know that and you're comfortable working, as many of us are because we've been in these villages, you can capitalize on that. But if you come in with good intentions but sharp elbows and you push your way in with a good Western idea and flop it down, folks often they can't maintain it when you're gone. It breaks and so forth. So you gotta get inside of their thinking a little bit. As far as building the bench for the 5 to 7 years out, if you don't have that, in my opinion, from day one when you cut the ribbon on the project, you're sunk because folks aren't going to maintain it. There's a $2 million a 2-year effort on the hillside above the town, the province capital of Bazarak, where we're doing our project. It's a wind farm. It has 10 kilowatt turbines, a battery house. It's a first-class project built by the provincial reconstruction team. And because the guy wires on the towers were not tightened at regular intervals, eventually 4 of the 10 towers are blown over, and now the site's falling into disrepair.
Wow.
But it's a training and a follow-up and an implementation effort, and then having those people that are doing that being held accountable by the local community, not by Americans or whoever that are going to leave the area. So that's a wartime tactical view, but there's some lessons in there, I think, for our audience.
It just looping back very quickly to the earlier question about social impact, return on investment. It's hard to measure that, though, isn't it, John? It's hard to measure sustainability out to 5 to 7 years because you just don't know, right?
That's right. If you're not there, you don't know.
Yeah.
There are ways to build in insurance policies, but it's never a guarantee that it's going to stay.
Yeah, great. Jake, you have a comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to talk just on this and the previous one. I think, from our perspective, in terms of what incentivizes the maintenance of that, 5 to 10 years down the road, it's not just the buy-in of the local village and community, which is obviously critical, from the very beginning of the project onwards. But it's also that if it's done with private capital, then there's somebody who cares very much about that continuing to be successful, because these projects typically have 10 to 20 year investment time horizons. And so, for us, even, there's a little bit of my own money tied up in these mini grids in Tanzania. And so I have an incentive to care about how that works 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or sell it or partner with someone who does. And so that creates an inherent incentive. One of the challenges to the social return. There is a lot of research out there that's been done that has varying degrees of success in, what is the return on investment of being connected to electricity. But if you ask almost anyone, would you rather have electricity or have none? I think the answer is usually relatively clear that they would prefer energy. And so, I don't think we should trip over ourselves too much to feel like, we haven't done like the perfect randomized control trial to prove that there's a massive return on this, because intuitively we know that there is benefits to energy. That said, making that case is important, because for rural mini grids, you do need some form of subsidy, essentially. So when I'm talking about providing energy to a bottling plant, like that's a standalone commercial case. No need for subsidy. You can just do that, with private capital purely. Rural electrification has always required some level of subsidy or public support. When you look at how the U.S. electrified, how China electrified, Brazil, et cetera. And there's no different in these places. Now, the difference is today with blended finance, with private capital, we can lower the amount of public support that's required, but we still need some. And so whether it's the PRECs, which seem fantastic to me, or whether it's MCC, which is providing basically targeted auctions where they will reward a developer with a connection subsidy if they successfully build a connection or deliver kilowatts of energy. This partnership between the public and private sector is critical, because we can bring from the private sector, say, 60, 70% of the capital that's needed for a rural mini grid. But we need that support to make the economic case. And it relates to this consumption point, because so just basic economics, round numbers, mini grid connection costs about $1,000 per connection in Africa. Average customer, when you hook them up, is only going to spend maximum maybe $10 a month on that. So that's an 8-year payback period, set before you even take into account OpEx and everything else. You can see those are tough economics. You have two solutions. One is that you need to lower your cost of capital by bringing in public dollars. The other is that you need to grow consumption more quickly. And you can do that by providing appliance financing. So we run this innovation lab with Rockefeller Foundation and some other partners in East Africa. We found that if you provide appliances on credit, you will see double the consumption in the first 6 months. Because obviously people get the connection for the first time, they don't have anything to plug in. But if you can offer them, hey, you can also get and not have to pay up front for a grain mill, for a television, for a small refrigerator, for a fan, then that helps both sides of the equation. Sorry, that was a little bit of a long answer, but I did want to get into some detail there.
No, it's a great answer. Sherwin, do you have an opinion on this?
I agree with everything Jake said. I don't have much more to add.
Yeah.
So,
Greg, can I just add a point on this?
Okay.
Yeah, I was just kind of want to talk about the policy level as well, because I mean, we want to make sure that if we are providing significant amount of donor dollars or even private sector investment, that there's a customer at the end of the day who's paying for that electricity. And it's true that sort of poor rural communities are less able to pay sort of traditional tariffs, and that's when you build in sort of lifeline tariffs or cross subsidy in the system. But we always start our projects with a willingness to pay study. And when we do this willingness to pay study, we are often surprised by the results. People are paying a lot of money for diesel energy. And so if you can get connected to an off-grid solution or an on-grid solution, you will be paying significantly less per kilowatt hour than in paying the tariff than you would if you just went to the store and bought some diesel energy for your generator.
Okay, that's a great point. And it reminds me of maybe, a summing up comment here. Why does U.S. leadership matter in leveraging advanced energy to stabilize regions of U.S. national interest in the developing world?
So I'll try to be brief on this, but you had mentioned prosperity, economic opportunity, stability, and security. And I think all those factors are tied up. And so from our perspective at MCC, we think that poverty reduction through economic growth provides that prosperity and economic opportunity, which provides that stability and that security. And I think for all those reasons, whether the US is looking at growing markets, Africa itself is population of 1.2 billion people, or you're looking at our own security and how do we stabilize these insecure regions, energy is absolutely central to that equation.
Any other comments on that one?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's just such a no-brainer. It's like there's a moral imperative to do it. Like, obviously, we want to do it for those reasons. There's a commercial reason to do it. Whether it's Tesla batteries or other products, like it's a market for U.S. goods. It's an area where we have competitive advantage in terms of advanced technology and financing expertise. And all the benefits redouble to the U.S. in terms of our own security, our leadership position, moral leadership position in the world, global health. There's very few things where you can just feel confidently that almost no matter what, that this is going to have a positive effect overall. I mean, this isn't lowering the cost. This isn't like an app that makes it easier for someone just to share a video on social media. Like, this is fundamentally changing lives.
Yeah, it's an overused term, soft power, maybe the ability to attract rather than repel and develop friends and allies around the world. And this is a distinctive area of U.S. strength and capability as reflected by all of you today. This was just a superb conversation. I really thank you all for your insights and your candor, and I'm certain that the audience appreciates it. So, and I would like to thank the audience as well for asking such excellent questions. If you'd like to rewatch today's event or share the stream with a colleague, a cache replay will be available on the Atlantic Council YouTube channel after the conference. And do be sure to tune in at 4 p.m. Eastern for another exciting panel discussion on the geopolitics of the energy transition. So thanks again to our audience. Thanks again to our terrific panel. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks very much.